I'm Macy Harlan, 32, a Kansas kid who worked her way up to Air Force captain. For years, I covered bills, showed up, and kept the peace for family, especially my cousin. But when he sneered, still broke after playing soldier at a diner, and my mom added, "She's just dead weight now," I drew a hard line that changed everything. Ever been undervalued by the very people you carried? Drop your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and earning your worth. What happened next might surprise you. I woke up at 0500 hours that morning in Junction City, Kansas, same as I had for the past 12 years. The difference was the bed, a queen in my childhood room instead of a rack on base. I'd been back stateside 3 weeks, freshly promoted to captain, 3, and still adjusting to the weight of the oak leaves that would come later. My mother's house smelled like coffee and something floral I couldn't name. Outside, the neighborhood was just starting to stir. I heard a dog bark, a car door slam, the ordinary sounds of people living ordinary lives. I pulled on running shoes and headed out before anyone could corner me with questions I didn't want to answer. The route took me past Brandon's old house, the one where we used to shoot hoops in the driveway until his mother called us in for dinner. He lived across town now, in a renovated loft his parents helped him buy. We were the same age, 32, born 3 weeks apart. We'd played on the same varsity soccer team, shared the same friend group, even applied to the same state school. But I'd enlisted instead, signed my papers 2 weeks after graduation while everyone else was planning dorm rooms and fraternity rushes. Brandon thought it was a phase. He told me so at my going-away party, laughing into his red Solo cup. "You'll be back by Christmas," he'd said. That was 14 years ago. I stayed in. He went to college on his parents' dime, then dropped out junior year to work at his uncle's car dealership. Last I heard, he was managing the lot and doing well enough to afford the loft and a new truck. I didn't begrudge him the success. What stuck with me was how he'd asked to borrow $3,000 2 years back when I was deployed, said it was for a down payment he couldn't swing on his own. I'd wired it from Bugram, didn't even ask for a timeline to pay it back. He never mentioned it again. I ran 4 miles that morning, then came back to find my mother at the kitchen table with her sister, Aunt Linda. They stopped talking when I walked in. My mother smiled, the tight kind that didn't reach her eyes. "There she is," she said. "Macy the early riser. Still on military time?" I poured myself coffee. Just used to it. Aunt Linda looked me over, her gaze catching on my Air Force shirt. Must be nice having all that structure. No decisions to make, just follow orders. I sipped my coffee and didn't take the bait. My mother laughed softly. She's always been like that. Even as a kid. Give her a rule and she'll follow it to the letter. There was something in her tone I couldn't quite place. It wasn't pride. I finished my coffee standing up, rinsed the mug, and excused myself to shower. Upstairs, I checked my phone and found a text from Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds, my mentor and former squadron commander. He'd been checking in since I left Kandahar, the kind of steady presence you learn to value in the service. His message was simple: "How's the homecoming?" I typed back, adjusting. He replied within a minute. "Take your time. They don't understand what you've been doing. That's not your fault." I appreciated that. Reynolds had a way of cutting through noise. He'd been the one to recommend me for the Joint Task Force assignment that led to my deployment, and he'd been the one to debrief me when I came back. He knew what it cost to be gone for months at a time, to carry the weight of decisions that didn't fit neatly into civilian conversation. I spent the rest of the morning unpacking boxes I'd shipped from my last posting. Most of it was practical: uniforms, books, a few personal items I'd kept through multiple moves. There were no photo albums, no sentimental collections. I traveled light by necessity and preference. That afternoon, my mother asked if I'd come to a family dinner that weekend. Brandon would be there, along with Aunt Linda and a few cousins I hadn't seen in years. She framed it as a welcome home gathering, but I knew it was more than that. My family didn't do casual. There was always subtext, always an undercurrent I'd learned to navigate carefully. "I'll be there," I told her. She seemed relieved. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. Morning runs, paperwork for my upcoming transfer to McConnell Air Force Base in Wichita, phone calls with Reynolds about my new role leading a training initiative. The work was straightforward, the kind of operational planning I'd done dozens of times. What felt strange was the silence around me. No flight line noise, no radio chatter, no constant hum of activity. Just the quiet of my mother's house and the occasional conversation that never went deeper than surface pleasantries. Brandon called Thursday night. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Macy, heard you were back. How's it feel to be home?" His voice was loud, enthusiastic, the same as it had always been. I could hear music in the background, voices laughing. "It's good," I said. "Settling in. Man, I can't wait to see you. It's been, what, for years?" "About that. Crazy. You still doing the pilot thing?" I bit back a correction. I wasn't a pilot. I was an intelligence officer, but I'd stopped explaining that years ago. People heard Air Force and assumed jets. "Still in uniform," I said. "That's wild. I don't know how you do it. All that travel, all those rules. I'd go insane." He laughed, and I heard someone else laugh with him. "Listen, I gotta run, but I'll see you Saturday, yeah? Mom's making her lasagna. I'll be there." He hung up before I could say anything else. I sat with the phone in my hand, staring at the screen. Brandon had never asked me what I did overseas. Not once. Not when I was in Bagram, not when I was in Kandahar, not when I'd spent 6 months in a forward operating base coordinating intelligence for combat operations. He'd never asked what it was like to write condolence letters for soldiers who didn't make it home, or what it felt like to sit in a briefing room and watch real-time footage of missions I'd helped plan. He just knew I wore a uniform and traveled a lot, and that seemed to be enough for him. I wondered sometimes if he even remembered the money. Probably not. It was a small thing to him, a favor from a cousin who had a steady paycheck. To me, it had been 3 months of deployment pay, carefully saved. I didn't resent him for not paying it back. What bothered me was the assumption that I had it to spare, that my life was somehow easier because I'd chosen a path he didn't understand. That night, I pulled out my deployment journal, a small field notebook I'd kept through multiple rotations. I didn't write in it much anymore, but I liked having it nearby. The pages were filled with notes, coordinates, names of people I'd worked with, reminders of things I needed to follow up on. Toward the back, there was a list I'd started on a particularly long night in Kandahar. It was titled Things They Don't Ask About, and it included entries like what it's like to sleep in full gear, how you decide who gets to go home first, what you do with the letters that don't get delivered. I closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer. Saturday would come soon enough. The dinner was at a family-style restaurant off Highway 57, the kind of place with vinyl booths and a laminated menu that hadn't changed in 20 years. I arrived at 1800 hours, 6 o'clock, because my mother had specifically said not to be late. Brandon was already there, leaning against his truck in the parking lot, scrolling through his phone. He looked up when I pulled in, grinned, and waved me over. There she is. Captain America herself. I walked over, and he pulled me into a hug that felt performative, the kind you give when other people are watching. His friends were with him, 2 guys I didn't recognize, both wearing expensive sneakers and cologne I could smell from 3 feet away. "Macy, this is Derek and Josh. We work together at the dealership. Guys, this is my cousin, the one I told you about. She's in the military." Derek nodded. "Air Force, right? That's cool. You fly?" "I work in intelligence," I said. Josh smirked. "So like, a desk job?" Brandon laughed, not unkindly, but he didn't correct him. "Hey, someone's gotta do the paperwork, right?" I let it go. Inside, the restaurant was crowded, warm, and loud. My mother had claimed a large table in the back, and Aunt Linda was already seated with 2 of my younger cousins, both in their 20s, both glued to their phones. My mother stood when she saw me, her smile brighter than it had been all week. "There you are. Come sit, we already ordered appetizers." I slid into the booth next to her, and Brandon took the seat across from me, his friends flanking him. The conversation started light, questions about the food, comments about the weather, small talk that filled the space without meaning much. Then Aunt Linda leaned forward, her voice carrying over the table. So Macy, what's next for you? Are you done with all the traveling, or are they sending you off again? I'm transferring to McConnell, I said. I'll be running a training initiative there. Training, she repeated, like she was testing the word. So teaching people how to do what you do? Something like that. Brandon jumped in, his tone light but pointed. Man, I don't know how you do it. All that moving around, no real home, no stability. Don't you ever just want to settle down? Get a normal job. I kept my voice even. I like what I do. Derek leaned back, arms crossed. But what do you actually do? Like, day to day? Is it just emails and meetings? Sometimes, I said. Other times it's coordinating with combat units, processing intelligence, making sure people have the information they need to stay safe. Josh made a face. Sounds boring. Brandon laughed, louder this time. Come on, man, don't say that. Macy's doing important work. She's serving her country. The way he said it, with that slight mocking edge, made it clear he didn't believe it. My mother, sitting beside me, said nothing. She was looking at her menu, her expression unreadable. The appetizers arrived: fried pickles, mozzarella sticks, the kind of food meant to be shared. Brandon grabbed a handful and kept talking. Seriously though, Macy, when are you gonna quit and do something real? You've done your time. You could come work with me at the dealership. We're always looking for good people. I met his eyes. I'm not quitting. Why not? What's keeping you there? The pay can't be that good. I didn't answer. He pressed on, his tone shifting to something that sounded like concern, but felt like condescension. I'm just saying, you're in your 30s now. Don't you want a family? A house? You can't do that while you're hopping bases every 2 years. Aunt Linda nodded. He's got a point, Macy. You've been doing this a long time. At some point, you have to think about your future. I wanted to tell them that I had thought about my future. That I'd planned it carefully, that I'd built a career I was proud of, that I'd earned respect and responsibility most people never touch. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I picked up my water glass and took a long drink. My mother finally spoke. Macy's always been independent. She doesn't need anyone telling her what to do. It should have felt like support, but the way she said it, flat, almost resigned, made it sound like criticism. Brandon's friends exchanged a glance and Derek chuckled softly. The rest of the meal followed the same pattern. Brandon held court, telling stories about his work, his weekend plans, his new truck. His friends laughed on cue, and my mother and aunt chimed in with questions that fed his narrative. I ate my food and listened, contributing only when directly asked. At one point, Brandon turned to me with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Hey, remember when you lent me that money a couple years back? For the down payment. I looked at him, surprised he'd brought it up. Yeah, man, that was clutch. You really saved me. He didn't say thank you. He didn't mention paying it back. He just moved on, launching into another story about a deal he'd closed at the dealership. I realized then that he didn't see it as a debt. He saw it as something I'd been happy to give, something I could afford because I didn't have the expenses he did. No mortgage, no car payments, no life that required real money. Just a steady paycheck from a job he didn't understand. When the check came, Brandon made a show of reaching for his wallet, then laughed and leaned back. You got this one right, Macy? You're the one with the government job. My mother smiled, a small, uncomfortable thing. Aunt Linda didn't look up from her phone. I pulled out my card and handed it to the waitress without a word. Brandon clapped me on the shoulder as we stood to leave. Thanks, cuz. You're the best. Outside, in the parking lot, I watched them pile into Brandon's truck, laughing about something I hadn't heard. My mother walked beside me to my car, quiet for the first time all night. They don't mean anything by it, she said. I unlocked my door. I know, but I didn't. I drove back to my mother's house in silence, the highway stretching out in front of me like a line I couldn't cross. The night was clear, the kind of open Kansas sky that made you feel small in the best way. I'd always liked driving at night. It gave me time to think without distraction, to process things I didn't have words for yet. By the time I pulled into the driveway, it was 2100 hours. The house was dark except for the porch light my mother had left on. I sat in the car for a few minutes, engine off, hands still on the wheel. I wasn't angry. Anger would have been easier. What I felt was something closer to exhaustion, the kind that settled deep and didn't lift with sleep. Inside, I poured a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table. My phone buzzed, Reynolds checking in again. How was dinner? I stared at the message for a long time before typing back. They don't get it. 3 dots appeared, then his response. They don't have to. You're not doing this for them. I set the phone down and leaned back in the chair. Reynolds was right, but that didn't make it easier. I'd spent years trying to bridge the gap between my life and theirs, to make them understand what the uniform meant, what service required. I'd told stories when they asked, sent photos from overseas, called home on holidays even when the time zones made it inconvenient. But somewhere along the way, I'd realized they weren't listening. They heard the words, but they didn't absorb them. To them, I was still just Macy, the girl who'd gone off to play soldier and never come back. That night, I pulled out my deployment journal again. I flipped to a blank page near the back and started writing, not for any official reason, just to get the thoughts out of my head. I wrote about the diner, about Brandon's laugh, about the way my mother had stayed silent when I needed her to speak. I wrote about the $3,000 I'd never see again, and the dozens of smaller favors I'd done over the years, co-signing loans, covering bills, showing up when no one else would. I wrote about Fallujah. Not the sanitized version I might tell a stranger, but the real one. The heat that made your uniform stick to your skin. The sound of mortars in the distance, close enough to feel but far enough that you kept working. The faces of the soldiers I'd briefed, young men and women who trusted me to give them accurate intelligence, to help them come home alive. The weight of knowing that sometimes, despite everything, they didn't. I wrote about the letters I'd helped write, the condolence notes that went to families who would never fully understand what their sons and daughters had done. I wrote about the nights I couldn't sleep, not because of fear, but because of responsibility. I wrote until my hand cramped, and then I closed the journal and put it away. The next morning, I went for a run earlier than usual, 04:30, before the sun was up. The streets were empty, the only sound my footsteps and my breathing. I ran past Brandon's old house again, past the high school, past the park where we used to hang out after soccer practice. Everything looked the same, but it felt different. Or maybe I was different, and the town was just what it had always been. When I got back, my mother was awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee. She looked up when I walked in, her expression cautious. You're up early. Couldn't sleep. She nodded, like that explained something. We sat in silence for a while, the kind that felt heavy but not hostile. Finally, she spoke. Brandon didn't mean anything by it last night. He's always been like that. You know how he is. I poured myself coffee, my back to her. Yeah, I know. He's proud of you. We all are. I turned around, leaned against the counter. Are you? She looked startled. Of course I am. Why would you ask that? Because you didn't say anything last night. When he was making jokes, when his friends were laughing, you just sat there. Her face tightened. I didn't think it was that serious. They were just teasing. It wasn't teasing, Mom. It was disrespect. And you let it happen. She looked down at her coffee, her hands wrapped around the mug. I don't know what you want me to say, Macy. You've built this whole life that none of us understand. You're gone for months at a time, and when you come back, you're different. Distant. It's hard to know how to talk to you. I felt something crack open in my chest, a frustration I'd been holding back for years. You could start by asking. You could ask what I do, what it's like, what I've seen. You could treat it like it matters. She looked up, her eyes wet. It does matter. But you're so closed off. You never talk about it. Because no one ever asks. The silence that followed was thick, uncomfortable. My mother looked away, and I knew the conversation was over. I finished my coffee, rinsed the mug, and went upstairs to shower. Later that day, I got a call from my new squadron commander at McConnell. He wanted to schedule a meeting to go over the training initiative, discuss timelines and objectives. I welcomed the distraction, the shift back into a world that made sense. We talked for an hour, and by the time I hung up, I felt steadier. That evening, Reynolds called. I told him about the morning conversation with my mother, about the tension that had settled over the house. You can't make them understand, he said. Some people just won't. They don't have the context, and they don't want it. That's not your failing. Then what do? You stop trying to prove yourself to them. You do the work, you lead your people, and you let the results speak for themselves. The people who matter will see it. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. The people who matter. In my years of service, I'd met hundreds of them, officers, enlisted personnel, contractors, allies from other nations. People who understood what it meant to serve, who carried the same weight I did. They were my community, my family in a way that blood relatives had stopped being. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to keep trying to bridge the gap. I wasn't going to explain myself or justify my choices. I was going to focus on the work, on the people who valued what I brought to the table. And if my family couldn't see it, that was their loss, not mine. 3 weeks later, I was officially transferred to McConnell Air Force Base in Wichita. The move was smooth, efficient, the kind of transition I'd done a dozen times before. I reported for duty at 0700 hours on a Monday, met my new team, and dove into the training initiative that would occupy the next year of my life. The work was demanding but satisfying. I was responsible for designing and implementing a squadron-level training program focused on intelligence integration in combat operations. It meant long hours, detailed planning, and constant coordination with other units, but it also meant I was doing something that mattered. I was teaching young officers and enlisted personnel how to process and analyze intelligence in real time, how to make decisions under pressure, how to keep their people safe. My team was solid: Captain Lowe, a sharp tactical officer with a dry sense of humor; Technical Sergeant Diaz, a veteran analyst with 15 years of experience; and Senior Airman Gwynn, a recent graduate from tech school who was eager and hungry to learn. They respected the work, respected each other, and respected me. It was the kind of environment I thrived in. I hadn't spoken to Brandon since the dinner. He'd sent a few texts, casual check-ins that felt obligatory, and I'd replied with one-word answers. My mother called once a week, and we talked about surface things: weather, errands, her book club. Neither of us mentioned the argument. Then, about 6 weeks into my assignment at McConnell, Brandon texted me asking for a favor. Hey cuz, quick question. Can you spot me $1,500 for rent? Got hit with an unexpected expense, and I'm short this month. I'll pay you back next paycheck, promise. I stared at the message for a long time. A year ago, I would have sent the money without hesitation. I would have told myself it was family, that helping was the right thing to do. But sitting in my small apartment on base, surrounded by the life I'd built on discipline and responsibility, I realized something. I didn't owe him anything. I typed back, "I can't help you this time. Sorry." The response came fast. Seriously? It's just $1,500. You've got a steady paycheck, no bills. Come on. I set the phone down and didn't reply. An hour later, he texted again. Fine. Whatever. Guess I know where I stand. I blocked the number. It felt harsh, final, but also necessary. That weekend, my mother called. Her voice was tight-clipped. Brandon told me you refused to help him. He's family, Macy. How could you do that? I kept my tone calm. I've helped him before. Multiple times. He never paid me back, and he never said thank you. I'm done enabling him. Enabling? He's your cousin. He's struggling. He's struggling because he makes bad decisions and expects other people to fix them. That's not my responsibility. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was colder. You've changed. You're not the girl I raised. You're right, I said. I'm not. I hung up before she could respond. The days that followed were hard, but not in the way I expected. I didn't feel guilty. I felt lighter, like I'd put down a weight I'd been carrying for years. I threw myself into the work, into the training initiative, into mentoring Gwynn and building a cohesive team. Reynolds called to check in, and I told him about the decision. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Good. You don't owe anyone proof of what you've done. You've earned the right to set boundaries." That became my mantra. I'd earned the right. I'd spent years giving time, money, patience to people who took without acknowledging what it cost. I'd deployed to war zones, led missions, made life-and-death decisions, and come home to a family that saw me as a paycheck with a uniform. I was done with that. The work at McConnell became my focus. I led briefings, designed training scenarios, coordinated with other squadrons. I mentored Nguyen, who reminded me of myself at that age, driven, uncertain, eager to prove herself. I watched her grow, watched her confidence build, and felt a sense of pride I hadn't felt in a long time. One afternoon, Captain Lowe pulled me aside after a briefing. "You're good at this," he said. "The teaching, the mentoring. You've got a way of making people feel like they can do the work, even when it's hard." I appreciated that more than I could say. That night, I sat in my apartment and thought about what I'd built. Not the career, though that mattered, but the relationships, the respect, the sense of purpose. I thought about the soldiers I'd briefed in Fallujah, the ones who'd come back and thanked me for giving them the intelligence they needed to survive. I thought about the letters I'd written, the families I'd helped honor. I thought about the young officers I was training now, the next generation who would carry the mission forward. I thought about the people who mattered, the ones who saw what I did and valued it. And I realized I didn't need my family to understand. I didn't need Brandon to respect me, or my mother to defend me. I had a community, a purpose, a life that was mine. That was enough. For months after the dinner, I found myself back in Junction City for a joint training event. McConnell was coordinating with a logistics unit stationed nearby, and I'd been tasked with leading a 2-day workshop on intelligence integration. The timing was coincidental, but it felt inevitable. The workshop went well. My team was sharp, the logistics personnel were engaged, and by the end of the second day, I felt confident we'd accomplished what we'd set out to do. That evening, Captain Lowe suggested we grab dinner before heading back to Wichita. The team agreed, and someone recommended the same diner where I'd had that disastrous family meal months earlier. I hesitated for a moment, then agreed. It was just a restaurant. We arrived at 18:30 hours, a group of 8 in uniform, tired but in good spirits. The diner was busy, the same vinyl booths and laminated menus I remembered. We took a large table near the back, and I found myself relaxing into the easy camaraderie of people who understood the work, who spoke the same language. We ordered food, swapped stories, laughed about the logistics officer who'd asked if we could just Google the intelligence. Technical Sergeant Diaz was in the middle of a story about a training exercise gone wrong when I glanced toward the front of the diner and saw them. Brandon and my mother, sitting in a booth near the window. They hadn't seen me yet. My mother was reading the menu, and Brandon was on his phone, scrolling absently. For a moment, I considered leaving, but that felt cowardly. I turned back to my team and focused on the conversation. If they saw me, fine. If not, that was fine too. We finished our meal, the conversation flowing easily. Captain Lowe paid the check, and we started gathering our things to leave. As we stood, I saw my mother glance up. Her eyes met mine across the diner, and I saw recognition flicker across her face. Brandon looked up too, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. I nodded, a small acknowledgement, and turned to follow my team out the door. We were halfway to the parking lot when I heard someone calling. "Wait. Excuse me, wait." I turned to see the waitress, a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a ponytail, hurrying after us. She looked flustered, almost breathless. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but there's been a mistake with your bill." Captain Lowe frowned. "I already paid." "I know, but—" She hesitated, glancing back toward the diner. "Your bill was paid. By someone else." I felt a strange stillness settle over me. "By who?" The waitress looked at Technical Sergeant Diaz, then at me, her eyes wet. "Those men in uniform," she said, her voice shaking. "The ones who just left. They said they remember Fallujah." The parking lot went quiet. I could feel my team looking at me, but I couldn't move. The waitress was still talking, her words tumbling out in a rush. "They didn't say much. Just that they served with you, that you saved lives. They wanted to cover your meal. All of it." I didn't know what to say. I nodded, managed a quiet, "thank you," and watched her walk back inside. Captain Lowe put a hand on my shoulder. You didn't mention you were in Fallujah. It was a long time ago, I said, my voice steady but my chest tight. We stood there for another moment, the team quiet, respectful. Then we got into the vehicles and headed back to base. I didn't look back at the diner. I didn't need to. Inside, my mother and Brandon had heard everything. I knew because when I'd glanced back, just for a second, I'd seen them through the window. My mother's hand was over her mouth, her face pale. Brandon was frozen, his phone forgotten on the table. They'd heard the waitress. They'd heard the words. We remember Fallujah. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt tired and ready to go home. That night, back in my apartment on base, I sat with my deployment journal open on the table. I didn't write anything new. I just read through the old entries, the notes and observations I'd made during those long months overseas. There was one entry, dated 3 years earlier, written during a particularly brutal week in Fallujah. It read, "Today we lost 2. I briefed them 72 hours ago. Gave them the intelligence. Walked them through the risks. They knew what they were walking into. One of them thanked me before they left. Said I was thorough. I don't feel thorough. I feel responsible." I closed the journal and set it aside. The men who'd paid our bill tonight, they'd been there. They'd known what that deployment meant, what it cost. They didn't need me to explain it. They'd lived it. And that, more than anything my family could say or do, was what mattered. Brandon's message came 2 weeks later. It was long, the kind of text that clearly took time to write. It started with an apology, then shifted into an explanation, then circled back to an apology again. The core of it was this: I didn't know you were there. I didn't know what Fallujah really meant. I looked it up after that night at the diner. I read about what happened, about the operations, the casualties. I didn't know you were part of that. I'm sorry for how I acted. I'm sorry for all of it. I read it twice, then set the phone down. I thought about responding right away, but I didn't. I needed time to figure out what I wanted to say, if I wanted to say anything at all. 3 days later, I typed back, "Now you do." That was it. 2 words. I didn't elaborate, didn't offer forgiveness or absolution. I just acknowledged that he knew and left it at that. He didn't respond, and I didn't expect him to. A week after that, my mother called. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message, her voice halting and unsure. "Macy, it's Mom. I wanted to talk. About what happened at the diner. About everything, really. I didn't understand. I didn't know. And I'm sorry. I should have asked. I should have listened. Call me when you can." I listened to it 3 times, then deleted it. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. I'd spent too many years waiting for her to understand, to see me for who I was rather than who she wanted me to be. The apology was a start, but it didn't erase the years of silence, the moments when she'd stood by and let others diminish what I did. I wasn't ready to forgive yet. Maybe I never would be. But I also wasn't interested in holding on to anger. A few days later, I drafted a short email. It was easier than a phone call, less immediate, less emotionally charged. I wrote, "Mom, I got your message. I appreciate the apology. But I need you to understand that this isn't just about the diner. It's about years of not being heard, of being dismissed, of feeling like I had to prove my worth over and over again. I'm not asking for praise. I'm asking for respect. If you can give me that, we can move forward. But it has to be real. No more standing by while other people mock what I do. No more treating my life like it's less important because you don't understand it." I hit send before I could second-guess myself. She replied the next day. "I understand. I'll do better. I promise." It wasn't much, but it was something. Over the next few weeks, we started small. She sent a card on my birthday, a simple one with no long message, just a note that said, "Proud of you." I sent back a text, "Thanks." She called on Sundays, and we talked about neutral things: her garden, my work, the weather. The conversations were brief, polite, but there was a carefulness to them, a recognition that we were rebuilding something fragile. I didn't invite her to visit, and she didn't ask. We were finding a new normal, one that didn't require constant proximity or forced closeness. It was enough. Brandon, on the other hand, stayed silent. I didn't hear from him again, and I didn't reach out. I thought about him sometimes, wondered if he'd told his friends what he'd learned, if it had changed how he saw me. But mostly, I just moved on. The work at McConnell continued. The training initiative was progressing well, and I'd been tapped to present our findings at a regional conference in Colorado Springs. It was a recognition of the work we'd done, and I was proud of it. More than that, I was proud of my team. Captain Lowe had taken on more leadership responsibilities. Technical Sergeant Diaz was mentoring junior analysts, and Senior Airman Gwynn had been recommended for early promotion. They were thriving, and that mattered more to me than any personal accolade. One afternoon, Gwynn pulled me aside after a briefing. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "Of course." How do you deal with people who don't get it? Who don't understand what we do?" I looked at her, saw the frustration in her eyes, and recognized it immediately. "You mean family?" She nodded. "My parents keep asking when I'm going to get a real job. Like this isn't real." I thought about how to answer, about what I wish someone had told me years ago. "You can't make them understand," I said. "Some people won't see it, no matter how much you explain. But that doesn't make it less real. What we do matters. The people we serve with, the missions we support, the lives we impact, that's real. Focus on that. Focus on the people who do get it. And let the rest go." She looked relieved, like I'd given her permission to stop trying so hard. "Thank you, ma'am." That night, I thought about my own advice. Let the rest go. It was easier said than done, but I was learning. Slowly, painfully, I was learning to let go of the need for my family's approval, to stop measuring my worth by their understanding. I was building a life that didn't require their validation. And that life was good. 2 years passed. I was promoted to major in the fall, a few months after my 35th birthday. The promotion was expected, the result of consistent performance and strong recommendations from my command chain. Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds called to congratulate me, his voice warm with pride. "You've earned this, Harlan. Keep doing what you're doing." The work at McConnell had evolved. The training initiative I'd built was now a model for other squadrons, and I'd been asked to lead its expansion across multiple bases. It was a significant responsibility, one that required travel, coordination, and long hours, but I thrived on it. I was doing work that mattered, work that would outlast my tenure and benefit the next generation of intelligence officers. My team had grown too. Captain Lowe had been promoted and transferred to another unit, but Technical Sergeant Diaz remained, now serving as my senior analyst. Senior Airman Gwynn had made Staff Sergeant ahead of schedule and was leading her own team. Watching them succeed felt like its own reward. My relationship with my mother remained careful but cordial. We talked every few weeks, and she'd visited once, a short weekend trip where we stuck to safe topics and avoided anything that might reopen old wounds. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional, and that was more than I'd expected. Brandon, I hadn't heard from at all. I'd unblocked his number months earlier, but he never reached out. I assumed he'd moved on, found other people to lean on. It didn't bother me anymore. One Thursday afternoon in early November, I got a call from the diner in Junction City. It was the waitress, Maria Lenz, the one who'd told me about Fallujah that night 2 years earlier. Her voice was tentative, like she wasn't sure if she should be calling. "Major Harlan? I hope it's okay that I'm calling. I got your number from the base directory. I wanted to tell you something." "Of course," I said. "What's going on?" "I don't know if you remember, but after that night, after those soldiers paid your bill, I couldn't stop thinking about it. About you. I did some research, read about Fallujah, about what happened there. And I wanted you to know that I'm grateful. For what you did. For all of it." I didn't know what to say. "Thank you. That means a lot." "There's something else," she continued. "Your family, your cousin, and your mom, they came back a few weeks after that night. Your mom asked about you, wanted to know if I'd seen you again. I told her I hadn't, but I could tell she was. I don't know, different. Like, she was trying to understand something." I absorbed that, surprised. "Did she say anything else?" "Just that she was proud of you. She wanted me to know that, in case I saw you again." We talked for a few more minutes, and then she hung up. I sat at my desk, staring at the phone, trying to process the call. My mother had gone back to the diner. She'd talked to Maria. She was trying, in her own way, to bridge the gap. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was something. That night, I drafted another email to my mother. This one was different, less guarded. I wrote, "Mom, Maria called me today. She told me you went back to the diner. I appreciate that. I know we've both made mistakes, and I know this hasn't been easy. But I want you to know that I'm okay. I'm more than okay. I've built a life I'm proud of, surrounded by people who respect the work I do. I hope, eventually, you'll be part of that too. But it has to be on terms that work for both of us. Let me know if you're ready for that." She replied the next morning. "I'm ready. Let's try." Over the following months, we did. She visited again, this time for Thanksgiving. It was awkward at first, but we found a rhythm. She asked about my work, and I told her not everything, but enough. She listened, really listened, and I saw something shift in her. She was trying to understand, to see me as I was, not as she'd wanted me to be. It wasn't perfect. We still had moments of tension, moments where old patterns threatened to resurface. But we were building something new, something more honest. And that was worth the effort. I thought about Brandon sometimes, wondered if he was doing the same kind of work with himself, the same kind of reckoning. I hoped he was, but I didn't need to know. My life had moved on. I was leading a program I believed in, mentoring officers who would carry the mission forward, and building relationships that mattered. One afternoon, I received a card in the mail. It was from Maria, the waitress, postmarked from Junction City. Inside was a simple handwritten note, "Major Harlan, the one they remember. Happy holidays." I smiled and pinned it to the bulletin board in my office, next to a photo of my squadron and a certificate of commendation from my last evaluation. It was a small thing, but it meant everything. That night, I sat down with my deployment journal and wrote a new entry, the first in months. 2 years ago, I thought I needed my family to understand what I'd done, what I'd been through. I thought their respect would make it all worthwhile. But I was wrong. I didn't need their respect. I needed my own. I needed to know that what I did mattered, that the sacrifices were worth it, that I'd lived up to the standard I set for myself. And I have. The people who matter, the ones who served alongside me, the ones I'm training now, the ones who remember Fallujah, they see it. They know. And that's enough. By the time I made Lieutenant Colonel, I was 39 years old. The promotion came through in the spring, and I reported to my new assignment at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. I was taking command of an operational wing, overseeing intelligence operations for a critical mission set. It was the kind of role I'd been working toward my entire career, and I was ready. The responsibility was significant, hundreds of personnel, millions of dollars in resources, decisions that would impact national security. But I wasn't intimidated. I'd spent nearly 2 decades preparing for this, learning from the best, making mistakes and correcting them, building a reputation as someone who could be trusted with the mission. My first day at Whiteman, I walked into the operations center and felt a sense of belonging I hadn't felt in years. This was my world, the briefings, the coordination, the constant hum of activity that meant people were doing their jobs well. I was home. Over the first few months, I focused on building relationships with my team, understanding their strengths and challenges, and implementing changes that would improve our effectiveness. I brought in some of the training methodologies I developed at McConnell, adapted them for the operational environment, and watched as my people rose to meet the standard. One afternoon, a young captain approached me after a briefing. She was sharp, confident, but there was something uncertain in her eyes. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "Of course. How do you balance it all? The work, the expectations, the pressure. How do you keep going?" I thought about the question, about all the years that had led me to this moment. "You focus on the mission," I said. "You surround yourself with good people, people who share your values. And you remember why you're doing this. It's not about the recognition or the rank. It's about the impact. The lives you help save, the people you mentor, the legacy you leave. That's what keeps you going." She nodded, and I saw something settle in her expression. "Thank you, ma'am." That night, I thought about legacy. Not in a grand, abstract way, but in the tangible sense of what I was leaving behind. The training programs I'd built, the officers I'd mentored, the missions I'd supported. Those were my legacy, the things that would outlast my time in uniform. I thought about the people who'd helped me along the way: Reynolds, who'd believed in me when I was still figuring out who I wanted to be; Diaz, who'd taught me the value of patience and precision; Nguyen, who'd reminded me why mentorship mattered. I thought about the soldiers in Fallujah, the ones who'd paid my bill that night at the diner, the ones who remembered. I thought about my mother, who was slowly learning to see me as I was, and about Brandon, who I hoped had learned something from the distance between us. And I thought about myself, the girl from Junction City who'd enlisted on a whim and built a life of purpose, the captain who'd deployed to war zones and come home changed, the lieutenant colonel who now led from the front. I'd earned this. Every promotion, every challenge, every moment of doubt and triumph. I'd earned it through discipline, dedication, and a refusal to settle for anything less than the standard I set for myself. One Saturday morning, I drove to Junction City to visit my mother. It had been 6 months since I'd last seen her, and I wanted to make the effort. We had lunch at her house, and for the first time in years, the conversation felt natural. She asked about my work, and I told her about the wing I was leading, the challenges and successes. She listened without interrupting, without trivializing. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm proud of you," she said. "I know I haven't always said it, but I am. What you've done, what you've built, it's remarkable." I squeezed her hand. "Thank you." After lunch, she suggested we drive by the old high school, take a walk around the neighborhood. We did, and as we walked past Brandon's old house, she brought him up. "Have you heard from him?" "No," I said. "Not in years." She nodded. "He's struggling. Lost his job at the dealership, went through a rough breakup. I think he's finally realizing the choices he made." I didn't feel vindicated or triumphant. I just felt sad for him, for the person he could have been if he'd made different choices. "I hope he figures it out," I said. And I meant it. That evening, I drove back to Whiteman, the Kansas plains stretching out around me. I thought about the long road I'd traveled, the people I'd met, the lives I'd touched. I thought about the girl I'd been and the woman I'd become. When I got back to base, I found a package waiting at my door. It was from Maria, the waitress. Inside was a framed photo, a picture of the diner, taken from the parking lot, with a small plaque that read, "Major Harlan, the one they remember." I hung it on the wall in my living room, next to my commission certificate and a photo of my squadron. It was a reminder of where I'd come from, of the moments that had shaped me, of the people who saw my worth even when others didn't. That night, I pulled out my deployment journal one last time. I flipped to the last page and wrote, "They laughed because they couldn't see past the uniform." But the men who remembered Fallujah? They didn't see a soldier, they saw a sister in arms. And that was enough. I closed the journal and set it on the shelf, where it would stay. I stood in front of the mirror in my quarters at Whiteman, adjusting the silver oak leaves on my shoulders. Lieutenant Colonel. The rank still felt new, even after 6 months. I'd reported for a morning brief at 0600, led a training exercise that afternoon, and now I was preparing for a formal dinner with senior leadership from across the base. It was the kind of event I'd grown accustomed to: professional, necessary, but not particularly enjoyable. My phone buzzed. A text from Technical Sergeant Diaz, now stationed at Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado Springs. "Saw your name on the promotion list for full bird. Congrats, ma'am. Well deserved." I hadn't seen the list yet. I opened my email and found the notification buried among operational updates and briefing requests. The selection board had recommended me for promotion to Colonel 06. If confirmed, it would come through in 18 months, right around my 41st birthday. I sat down on the edge of my bed, the weight of it settling over me. Colonel. It was a rank I'd aspired to but never quite believed I'd reach. Not because I doubted my abilities, but because I knew how competitive it was, how many qualified officers competed for so few slots. I called Reynolds. He answered on the second ring. "Harlan. I was wondering when you'd see it." "You knew. I wrote one of your recommendations." "Of course I knew." He paused. You've earned this 10 times over. Don't second guess it. I'm not second guessing. I'm just processing. Process later. Right now, accept the congratulations and keep doing what you're doing. I smiled. Yes, sir. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my quarters and let myself feel it, the pride, the satisfaction, the sense that everything I'd worked for was finally coming together. I thought about the girl who'd enlisted at 18, uncertain and naive, who'd believed that service meant something even when others mocked it. I thought about the captain who'd deployed to Fallujah, who'd made decisions that saved lives and carried the weight of the ones she couldn't save. I thought about the major who'd built training programs and mentored young officers, who'd learned to set boundaries and demand respect. And now, the lieutenant colonel who would become a colonel, who would lead at the highest levels, who would shape policy and strategy and leave a mark that would last long after she retired. The formal dinner that night was at the Officers' Club, a stately building with dark wood paneling and portraits of past commanders lining the walls. I arrived at 18:45, 15 minutes early as always, and found myself seated next to a newly assigned brigadier general, a sharp woman in her late 40s who'd spent her career in logistics. Lieutenant Colonel Harlan, she said, extending her hand. I've heard good things about your work at McConnell. The training initiative you built is being replicated across the command. Thank you, ma'am. That was always the goal, to create something sustainable. It's rare to see that kind of foresight at the field grade level. Most officers are so focused on their next assignment, they don't think about legacy. I appreciated the compliment but deflected. I had good mentors. They taught me to think beyond my own career. The general smiled. That's another rare quality. Hold on to it. The dinner proceeded smoothly, speeches from the wing commander, updates on operational priorities, the usual mix of ceremony and substance. I listened, engaged when appropriate, and slipped out as soon as it was polite to do so. Back in my quarters, I changed into running clothes and headed out into the cool Missouri night. Running had always been my way of processing, of clearing my head when the noise got too loud. I ran the perimeter of the base, the familiar rhythm of my footsteps grounding me. I thought about my mother, about how far we'd come. She called every Sunday now, and our conversations had deepened. She asked about my work, my challenges, my goals. She told me about her life, about the book club she'd joined, about the volunteer work she was doing at the local library. We were building something real, something that didn't require me to shrink myself or prove my worth. I thought about Brandon, about the silence that had settled between us. I didn't miss him exactly, but I missed the version of him I'd known before the resentment set in. I wondered if he'd found his footing, if he'd learned the lessons he needed to learn. I hoped he had, but I didn't need to know. I thought about the officers I was mentoring now, the ones who reminded me of myself at their age, ambitious, uncertain, hungry for guidance. I thought about the impact I could have on their careers, on their lives, on the Air Force as a whole. And I thought about Fallujah. Always Fallujah. The deployment that had defined me, the missions that had tested me, the soldiers who had trusted me, the men who'd paid my bill at the diner, who'd said they remembered. That memory was sacred, a reminder of what mattered, of who I was when everything else was stripped away. When I got back to my quarters, I found another email waiting. It was from Captain Gwynn, now Major Gwynn, stationed at Langley Air Force Base. She'd been selected to lead an intelligence squadron, a significant jump in responsibility. Ma'am, I wanted you to be the first to know. I got the squadron. I couldn't have done it without your mentorship. Thank you for believing in me when I wasn't sure I belonged. I'll do my best to pass it forward. I read the email 3 times, feeling a swell of pride that was almost overwhelming. This was why I did it. Not for the promotions or the recognition, but for moments like this, watching someone I'd invested in succeed, knowing that the work would continue long after I was gone. I replied simply, you earned it. Lead with integrity. Make them better. That night, I dreamed of the diner. In the dream, I was sitting at the table with my team, laughing about something I couldn't quite remember. The waitress, Maria, approached with a bill, but when I reached for it, she shook her head. It's already taken care of, she said. They remember. I woke at 04:30, the dream still vivid in my mind. I dressed in my running gear and headed out into the pre-dawn darkness, running through the quiet streets of the base. The air was crisp, the sky just beginning to lighten in the east. I ran past the operations center, past the flight line, past the rows of dormitories where junior enlisted personnel were still sleeping. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs ached, until the noise in my head quieted and all that was left was the steady rhythm of my breathing. When I got back to my quarters, I showered, dressed in my uniform, and headed to the operations center for the morning briefing. The day was full, meetings, decisions, coordination with other units. But I was ready for it. I was ready for all of it. Because I'd earned it. Every rank, every responsibility, every moment of respect. I'd earned it through years of discipline, through deployments and sacrifices, through the quiet work of showing up and doing the job when no one was watching. I'd earned it in Fallujah, in the operations center at Kandahar, in the training rooms at McConnell. I'd earned it in the moments when I set boundaries, when I said no, when I demanded respect instead of begging for it. I'd earned it through the officers I'd mentored, the programs I'd built, the missions I'd supported. Through the letters I'd written, the briefings I'd given, the decisions I'd made. I'd earned it not because my family finally understood, but because I no longer needed them to. The people who mattered, the ones who served alongside me, the ones who remembered Fallujah, the ones who would carry the mission forward, they knew. And that was enough. 1 year later, I was standing in the wing commander's office at Whiteman, looking out the window at the flight line. The promotion to colonel had come through 3 months earlier, just after my 41st birthday. The eagles on my shoulders still felt weighty, significant in a way the previous ranks hadn't. This wasn't just another step up, this was senior leadership, the kind of position where your decisions affected thousands of people and shaped the direction of entire programs. The wing commander, Brigadier General Patricia Moss, sat behind her desk reviewing a proposal I'd submitted. She was the same general I'd met at the formal dinner a year ago, and she'd become an unexpected mentor. Unlike Reynolds, who guided through quiet wisdom, General Moss led through direct challenge. She pushed, questioned, demanded excellence, and I thrived under that kind of leadership. "This is ambitious," she said, not looking up from the document. "You're proposing a complete restructuring of how we integrate intelligence across combat operations." "Yes, ma'am. The current model is fragmented. We're losing efficiency and, in some cases, putting people at risk because information isn't flowing the way it should." She looked up, her expression neutral. "You understand this will require buy-in from multiple commands, significant resources, and at least 2 years to implement." "I do. And you're prepared to lead it?" "I am." She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. I'll forward this to the Major Command. But Harlan, if this moves forward, it's going to be your project. You'll own the successes and the failures." "Understood, ma'am." She signed the document and handed it back to me. "Good. Now get out of here and enjoy your weekend. You've been in this building for 14 hours straight." I glanced at my watch. It was 19:30, 7:30 in the evening. She was right. I'd been so absorbed in the work that I'd lost track of time. "Yes, ma'am." I left the operations center and walked to my car, the Missouri evening warm and humid. My phone buzzed, a text from my mother. "Call when you can. Nothing urgent, just want to catch up." I smiled. A year ago, those messages would have filled me with dread, anticipation of another uncomfortable conversation or veiled criticism. Now, they were just what they appeared to be, a mother wanting to talk to her daughter. I called her from the car. "Macy, how are you?" "Good. Busy. Just wrapped up a long day." "They're working you too hard." "I'm working me too hard. There's a difference." She laughed, and it sounded genuine. "Fair enough. Listen, I wanted to tell you something. I've been taking a class at the community college. Military history. The professor mentioned Fallujah in one of the lectures and I finally understood what it was. What you did there." I felt something tighten in my chest. "Mom, let me finish. I've been thinking about that night at the diner, about what those soldiers said. We remember Fallujah. I didn't know what that meant then. But I do now. And I'm sorry it took me so long." I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex and sat in the car, engine running. Thank you. That means a lot. I know I can't take back the years I didn't understand. But I want you to know I'm trying now. Really trying. I know you are. We talked for another 20 minutes, and when we hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, hope. Not for a perfect relationship, but for an honest one. For something built on mutual respect rather than obligation. Inside my apartment, I changed into civilian clothes and made myself dinner, pasta with vegetables, simple and efficient. I ate at the small table by the window, looking out at the parking lot and the trees beyond. My life was quiet, structured, exactly the way I liked it. My phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from Major Nguyen. She was thriving at Langley, her squadron consistently rated as one of the top performers in the command. Her message was brief. Ma'am, I'm putting together a panel on leadership for junior officers. Would you be willing to participate? It would mean a lot to have you there. I replied immediately. Send me the details. I'm in. The next morning, Saturday, I drove to Kansas City to meet Reynolds for coffee. He'd retired 6 months earlier and moved to a small house outside the city. He looked different in civilian clothes, relaxed, lighter somehow, but still carrying that quiet authority that had made him such an effective leader. We sat at a cafe overlooking the river, and he asked about the proposal I'd submitted. If it gets approved, it'll be the biggest project of my career, I said. And if it doesn't? Then I'll find another way to make the impact I want to make. He smiled. That's the right answer. You can't control the decisions above you. You can only control how you respond. You taught me that. I reminded you. You already knew it. We talked for an hour about his retirement, about the Air Force, about the changes we'd both seen over the years. He asked about my family, and I told him about the progress with my mother, about the continued silence from Brandon. Does it bother you, he asked, that your cousin never reached out? I thought about it. Not anymore. I think he's dealing with his own stuff, and that's not my responsibility. I hope he's okay, but I don't need to know. Reynolds nodded. You've come a long way, Harlan. When I first met you, you were so focused on proving yourself to everyone. Now you just do the work and let it speak for itself. I had good teachers. You were a good student. On the drive back to Whiteman, I thought about what he'd said. I had changed. The woman who'd sat at that diner 3 years ago, absorbing mockery and disrespect, was gone. In her place was someone who knew her worth, who demanded respect because she'd earned it, who didn't need external validation to feel proud of what she'd accomplished. Monday morning, I got word that the proposal had been approved. General Moss called me into her office at 0800 hours. Congratulations, Colonel. You're now the lead for the Intelligence Integration Initiative. You'll have a staff of 12, a budget I won't disclose over unsecured channels, and 2 years to make it work. I felt a surge of adrenaline. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet. This is going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. You're going to face resistance from commands that don't want to change, from personnel who think the old way is good enough, from bureaucrats who'll question every dollar you spend. Are you ready for that? Yes, ma'am. She stood and extended her hand. Then get to work. I spent the next 3 weeks assembling my team, pulling the best people I could find from across the command. Major Nguyen was my first call. I needed her expertise and her drive. Technical Sergeant Diaz was the second. I brought in a logistics officer from Shaw Air Force Base, a communications specialist from Langley, and a handful of junior officers who reminded me of myself at their age. The work was intense, consuming, but deeply satisfying. We were building something that would change how the Air Force operated, that would save lives and improve effectiveness. Every late night, every difficult conversation, every bureaucratic hurdle was worth it because I knew the impact would be real. One evening, about 6 weeks into the project, I received a letter in the mail. The return address was from Junction City, but the handwriting wasn't my mother's. I opened it carefully. It was from Brandon. Macy, I know it's been a long time. I know I don't deserve a response. But I wanted you to know that I've been working on myself. I went to therapy, dealt with some things I should have dealt with years ago. I've been sober for 8 months. I got a job at a nonprofit helping veterans transition to civilian life. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just asking you to know that I finally understand what I couldn't see before. You were never the problem. I was. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're proud of what you've built. You should be. Brandon. I read the letter twice, then set it aside. I felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even relief. Just a quiet acknowledgement that he was on his own journey, one that didn't require my participation. I didn't write back. But I didn't throw the letter away either. I filed it in a drawer, a small piece of history that no longer had power over me. 3 months later, I stood in front of an auditorium at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, addressing 200 junior officers at a leadership symposium. Major Nguyen had organized the panel, and I was the keynote speaker. I talked about integrity, about resilience, about the importance of knowing your worth without needing others to validate it. I talked about Fallujah, not in detail, but enough to let them know I understood the weight of the decisions they'd be asked to make. And at the end, I told them the story of the diner. Not for sympathy, not for vindication, but as a lesson. They laughed because they couldn't see past the uniform, I said. But the men who remembered Fallujah? They didn't see a soldier. They saw a sister in arms. And that was enough. Find your people. The ones who see you, who understand the work, who value what you bring. Those are the people who matter. Everyone else is just noise. The room was silent when I finished. Then, slowly, they stood and applauded. Later, as I was leaving, a young captain approached me. She looked nervous, uncertain. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you. I've been struggling with something similar. Family who doesn't understand, who makes me feel like what I'm doing doesn't matter. Your story helped." I put my hand on her shoulder. "It matters. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise." She nodded, eyes wet, and walked away. I stood there for a moment, watching the crowd disperse, feeling the weight and the lightness of it all. This was my legacy. Not the rank, not the programs, not the recognition. This. The young officers who would carry the mission forward, who would lead with integrity, who would remember that service meant something. I walked out into the Alabama sunshine, ready for whatever came next. Thanks for staying with me. If this hit home, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs the reminder. Quick questions for you. Have you ever had family dismiss your work or service? What boundary did you set, and did it stick? If you were at that diner table, what would you have said? Have you ever had a quiet, we remember moment that changed how others saw you? Drop your answers in the comments. I read every one.